Can you now quote a line of your own that you think sort of has to do with this dilemma?
Oh my goodness.
You can have a
How about if I read a poem?
Fantastic, yeah.
Give me a moment to find. The first poem that I'll read is, I have a nephew who has autism. It's not something I hear about much in Egypt now, but you all know. So there's a word in English called stimming, which I find, and so many, I think, poems often come from you hearing the word and getting so attracted to it. Stimming is what autistic people, particularly children, do when they're in a kind of physical state of reverie. And it's about shaking, and usually your hands are going like this. It's not nervous shaking, it's that your body is electrified. It's sort of extraordinary to watch. It's sort of very, very beautiful. And so this poem is called Quiet Hands. And it's an expression my sister-in-law, my brother, say to my nephew to have quiet hands, to kind of calm down. My nephew is stimming this morning, marching in place, grinning at the parade only he knows is passing, now rocking like a monk, now fluttering his fingers into the wing beat of a hummingbird. Why is he so impatient with our infirmities? We don't see the flowers he drinks from, his garden we're trampling. And then here's a poem that I wrote. I do a lot of mountain climbing, and I was in the Himalayas, and I was on Mount Everest the day last June that 8 people died trying to summit the mountain. And I also found out on that day that that very morning, when you fly into the Himalayas, you fly from Kathmandu into a mountain camp that's very high up, and then you have a very low plane to start from there. And the plane that I had taken 2 days earlier that morning crashed, and 17 people died on that little plane, and 8 people died on the mountain. So this poem was written at that moment in the Himalayas. How much oxygen does it take to ask a question? To form the syllables of a truthful sentence? To rattle the cracked lip whispers of one lie? It's said that other animals exist in an endless present. We humans are the only creatures that are free not to show up to ourselves, for whom the idea of being here can be uneasy. With everything our bodies know, we do not have the luxury of making ourselves simple. This will always be an uneasy place, an altitude of sudden storms, weak footholds, rock and crevasse, a black and blue terrain. And I think if I had to leave with one, I think if you ask for one phrase of ours, I think that's one, is that people, because we're conscious, because we're thinking, we don't have the luxury of being simple. Every day is complicated about how we think about our lives and what we do. And so there's the urge to politics in that very sense of complexity of what we have.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for having us today and being kind in Egypt. And I would like to take a moment and actually try to get some information because I'm kind of confused about not having the audience for the American public at the moment. So I would like to ask you if we go back in memory, say between 95 and 98. I personally was present when Allen Ginsberg came to our campus back then in Philadelphia at UPenn, and the entire East Coast was there, not just the campus. Okay? So, and of course we all wanted to hear America, right? And I don't want to say the first sentence in front of my students because you know what he said, but we really wanted to hear that, and we wanted to be in his presence. So if I take him as an example, who was a very decent product of Whitney, say, and I take again democracy. You very great talk this morning. Where does this come into reality with American poets today? And is democracy really holds the same definition as it did with Ginsberg, with Whitman, with Perlman, who was my professor? Okay, he's getting old and he's being a grandfather now, but back then, that's like 18 years ago, he was still, coming up, and all his generation. Why is it that the Poetry House or the Writers' House, Kelly Writers' House, doesn't have the same audience as it did in the 90s? What's happened? Is it because we all can see and tell that democracy is so, it's actually democracy. I mean, how are you defining democracy? And from which angle? And which ethnic group in America is defining democracy? And to whose best benefit? The African Americans, the Hispanics, the Latinos, the Jewish Americans, the Arab Americans? Which Americans? Which democracy?
Well, I think you eloquently put your finger on something deeply important. That, first of all, democracy and the definition of democracy belongs to no one, not to Americans, not to ancient Greeks, not to anyone. And what I would say is, and partly even this gets contested, right, but it's not even the pragmatics of democracy in political practice that matter. They are the values, what are the values that must underlie any democracy? And those become issues of clear representation of everyone, which clearly we still struggle with the United States. So does everyone have an opportunity to vote or participate in a fair way? Second is respect for laws, and third is the rights of minorities protected within a majority system. How do you balance that? As I said, freedom of expression, situation for laws, and freedom generally of mobility within that structure. And then you take those things, that democracy can get manifest in lots of different ways and be healthy for different countries and at different times. We don't have any special hold on those beliefs. Those are timeless and human. And to my mind, I'm looking to Egypt to see how you manifest democracy and how I can learn from it. There is, and Americans can look to the rest of the world to see people in urgent moments struggle and try to define what's right. So even in America, I don't think we have to just look at one community of who defines democracy and where it's best. We can look elsewhere as well. We're in this global time, and we, I think, want to be modest enough to learn from it and participate in it. And then speak to the values that we believe in the most when we practice them ourselves. And so that has to make us modest too, because of our own failures to do that.
Was it much clearer when, I mean, the audience of Ginsberg?
No, it was not much
Did he
clearer.
have a much clearer vision?
No, it was not much clearer. I think it's our nostalgia for looking at clearer time. Post-war America had lots of discrimination and values. And there were very few women writers that people were paying attention to at Ginsberg's time. So just to give you a tiny anecdote about the confusions, Ginsberg said, to use his own words, as a scrawny, hairy Jew, he said, how do I get taken seriously on the world stage? So not just writing his poems, but be taken seriously in the audience. And his Swami told him, people in suits are taken seriously. So always wear a suit. And so for the rest of his life, every reading, Allen Ginsberg had on a suit. And so there's that sense of an artist lives in a practical world and needs to make a compromise or needs to make an impression. And so there was no idyllic time there too. It's always a struggle. And what was great about Ginsberg, and I hope that many artists have learned from that, is he went through that struggle with a big sense of humor and generosity and grace. So
Yes. And we really talk about a lot, I believe.
We have two questions at the back.
yes, sorry.
My name is Matthew.
Yes.
Student in the department. We're studying in this department that poetry or literature as a whole can be a significant tool for resistance. And also, you also mentioned the same point by speaking with poets or poetry as a way of giving voice to the voiceless and the powerless. How can poets who are actually marginalized in this country give voice to the voiceless if they themselves do not have a voice?
I'm not sure what the question was in that. How to do that?
How can poets?
How can they?
Poets who are marginalized in this
Yes.
country give voice to the voiceless if they themselves.
Oh,
do
I
not
see.
have a voice?
Oh, because then the best people to give voice to the voiceless and oppressed are people who understand that condition. It's one of the reasons I like to read the poetries of other experience besides privileged white men. The voices of people who understand what it is not to be given your voice. You get it, so it's common experience, I think, that gives poets that. But it's always your doubt, too. What right do I have as an artist to speak for anyone else? And two things happen with that. That kind of humility may make you a better artist, or the risk is that, like some of the American writers I was talking about, it also may mean you get solitary and speak to yourself instead, because you get afraid or about speaking for others, or you want the safety of your own solitude. So you have to take the risk and you have to be modest about it at the same time.
Okay.
Actually, my poem is very poem and poetry of solitude. Actually, because of that, there's a trend against this kind of poetry and a sort of frustration towards this kind of poetry. So I studied in my course, political poetry major, that mixing art and politics. So it's all about personal experiences that share this collective thing with all human beings. So why this kind of reaction towards this kind of poetry? And in my opinion, I think that having this kind of reaction towards this poetry is contradictory, as expressing whatever thought I have in poetry is very important, as long as it's liberate me at the end. And actually, I think that we should encourage all kinds of poetry, private ones or personal, and those who share or express this political setting yourself free and expressing whatever you want, but at the same time, we are against those rights and the poetry related.
Sure. Those are very good insights. I think the answer I have to that is that good art comes out of contradiction. When things are safe and you understand why you're writing and what you're doing, that is very often going to be bad art. And that's why sometimes political art becomes bad, because it's about the message and the clarity of what you need. Rise up, do this, get that. And that message everybody knew already.
Becomes sort of character and then being liberating.
Yeah, so I think the artist is going to dwell in contradiction, which is also what Emily Dickinson called dwelling in possibility. Possibility is what you're not sure of. And dwelling is like being, in a reverie of disbelief and unbelief, and then finding art in that. And so I would say contradiction is a really important thing for any writer and artist. So I would think it would be a comfortable place to be uncomfortable as comfortable as for an artist. That paradox makes sense. And not having a clear plan of this is how poetry should work, this is the unfettered way forward. So that's what I would argue for. And then again, also that art has its own tempo and its own strangeness. I mean, you don't know where a poem comes from or why and when. And if you sit down because you know what you have to write, and this has to get out there, well, those are telegrams or text messages of a certain kind of eloquence. But they may only become poems in retrospect. I think poems that really work don't have a clear agenda. There's a happenstance and strangeness that takes them where they have to go, independent of your conscious mind.
First, I would like to thank you so much for being with us. And my name is Aya, and I'm a sophomore. I was always wondering why difficult situations and painful moments bring out the masterpieces of poets, or through these kind of situations or moments, some people actually discover their poetry. Why is inspiration working on that? I mean, sometimes I feel they work better in difficult situations, so why does it work like that, whether it's political wise or anything else? I'm wondering why is difficult situations bringing the best out of us?
I wouldn't say that difficult situation is necessary for making the poem. I think what Dr. Fromme and I were both saying was some way the difficult moments, and I've forgotten your name. Yes. We're saying that when difficult moments mean we're broken and more empty than in successful and strong moments. So our needs are greater. And so I think we're going to be more receptive to poems at times like that, because it's connecting with someone else who's suffered and we relate to that feeling. So I think that's the sense about brokenness. The other thing that I do think happens, as I was just describing about contradiction, I do think that good art rarely comes out of self-satisfied, comfortable place. It comes out of something. You only start to think differently when things are not exactly right. But that's not difficult for us to do, because humans are always eager for something new, right? We're always somewhat unsatisfied with ourselves or things around us. And the question in our lives, whether through poetry, through religious practice, through our work, is how do we take that dissatisfaction and make it productive and make it generous to other people. And art is one way, but creative expression in however you live your lives and bringing that generosity is important. And it's, to my mind, one of the things that you're doing, which is so wonderful, is to study literature, so that you'll have those resources and things to be able to call on in your own lives and share with other people whatever paths you choose. Because life is hard. Life is very hard, and we need those things. We need the voices of people who've gone before us and had experience, and people now who may have time we don't have, or access to language that didn't occur to us, to share that common experience.
Yes, thank you for this amazing lecture. And my question is a comment on your, when you said that democracy is forgetting our ancestors. That democracy make everyone forget his ancestors. Okay? Is that really democracy means to forgetting your ancestors, your tradition, your past? Is that really mean? And by forgetting us, our ancestors, we will really achieve democracy? And what kind of democracy it will be?
It's a very powerful question, but I just want to remind you, those were the words of a French writer, Tocqueville, who was looking at early America from an experience of an aristocratic, monarchical government in France for centuries, and seeing, here's this new experiment in democracy, and how would he weigh benefits and detriments to that. And he was saying that democracy has in it, at its core, people looking out for their self-interest. It doesn't mean when you create it in government and when you live it in practice, you only have to do that. No. I mean, the best democracy will care for people less fortunate, will care for future generations, and the elderly who may need us now that they can't work for themselves. Any good government has to have, and values, has to have people of great compassion and connectedness. But what he's saying is, in its raw form, kind of the theoretical raw form, a danger of democracy is everybody out for him or herself. And so it's about being careful to check that. Democracy, of course, can care for others, but its risk is in its selfishness. And, you know, every other form of government has risks too. I mean, there are many, many detriments to French monarchy, so it wasn't that that was the better alternative. And again, Egypt will have to confront all of these trade-offs in its own commitment to tradition, issues of freedom of expression, rights of minorities. How does all that get manifest in government? And you're part of choosing that at a very urgent time. You know, but there is no one answer.
Let me say something to tie up what has been said. I was sharing a research experience with my graduate class a few days ago about an assignment that I had to do for my promotion. I had to write about the translation of English Romantic poetry into Arabic. Initially, I started off very unhappy about the focus, but as I proceeded in reading about who was interested in Romantic poetry and how the poets of Egypt started translating Romantic poetry, you mentioned Shelley, and I discovered that the Skylark, Shelley's Skylark, was translated 15 times at the beginning of the 20th century in Egypt. And it was a very interesting discovery for me to realize that it is the poetry of the Romantic movement that inspired some intellectuals in Egypt to revolt against the monarchy and to revolt against the British imperialism. Now, okay, that's a comment, okay? But then I have a question. Why is it that when a poem or a lyric gets sung, all right, and is put to music, we no more question the value of poetry, and we immediately start singing it, and we value it all the time. I mean, everyone does. What happens when music, or music with this extra dimension, not simply rhyme and rhythm, but music, when it's set to music, what happens?
You know, I've been long obsessed with, I teach a seminar for graduate students called Writers and Their Musical Obsessions. The music they listen to and why, how do they write about it, care about it. So I think about these, but it's a powerful philosophical question, right? What are the differences between poetry and music and what happens? But I think the short answer is that music is something very physical that happens to our bodies. So songs that you even know well, the lyrics disappear in some sense, and a song's expression becomes part of like your heartbeat or breathing. And so it's just part of something that animates you. And so the lyrics they become either, it's a contradictory thing between disappearance and kind of being rooted in you at the same time, but they're not conscious in the same way that reading on the pages. So, but that's a powerful thing for a song to do. It's why singing and music are even more popular by far than poetry. And the popularity of poetry is still in the same vein of rhythm and beat that echo our heartbeat and our walking and movement and the way we feel. That every kind of expression of art that we care about does something to echo our bodies, how we breathe and move and see and hear.
Wonderful image. We can now have a final question, I think, all right?
Okay, sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question since you are a poet. You write when a specific event evokes in you a certain feelings and ideas, so you write about it. When your ideas or when your poetry get published, it's interpreted in so many different ways. Is it okay with you? Because sometimes we came across it like a lot in different poems. The actual idea of the poet are just lost. Is it okay for you to feel that your idea or your actual idea is no longer there, or this is the actual function of literature and poetry, is to be able to suit different situations in different cultures?
That is such a brilliant question, and it's an age-old question about every artist and writer. You know, but again, if you do think there's some solitude to you writing, something you know you mean, the great thing is you have to let it go. Your own children will have to grow up. You know, and you won't be able to control what they believe and think and what they want in life. And there will always be part of you in them, right? That genetic makeup, that commonality, what you've taught them. But they grow up. And poems, if they're any good, have a life that means you're reading them now. That's the most a poet can ask for. That's an extraordinary gift, is that you use and read and understand the poems in your terms. And what you obviously do with great teachers is you try to understand where those poems came from. But the poem's now yours, you know? So you try to do the real work of scholarship and connection and looking back and having some context. But now it's yours, and if you're going to remember it and care about it, and in these moments when we say we need nourishment, it's not because I, at that moment, want to give you my poem or say, no, you can't have it, this is not for your nourishment now. It's yours. And so we never have to apologize for how people use art, for that's the generosity of good art. Thank you again so much.
This has been a marvelous occasion for us. Thank you very much, Tom, for coming.